So, hi, my name is Jeff Sapiro. I've been a teacher at Sister Sophie for just under 3 years now, I think. And I have a long background in teaching and in the humanities. I began as a history major, actually, as undergraduate, but I moved on because I had a strong interest in literature and also philosophy. So I've taught in many different places, many different kinds of students, and I think of myself now mainly as a teacher and an educator.
Okay, so back to literature. So why do you think teaching literature above other areas of language studies, would be your preference after years of, either research or pursuits in the field? Yeah. Because I believe you must have been through teaching of language studies as well.
Yes. Well, I think it connects in the beginning to the power of stories. I mean, I love to teach literature, and I love to teach, reflective essays as well that combine storytelling and reflection and argument. I think that when students are engaged with stories, that's when they become able to ask questions. They're motivated in a way that they might not be if they were simply learning, a language as a technical thing.
Yeah.
Storytelling.
So.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And that's the way it was for me too. I never would have learned ancient Greek if it was a matter of just going to a classics department and memorizing paradigms. I learned Greek because I had a teacher who turned me on to the kinds of questions that were in Greek texts, and it was my experience of reading those texts that motivated me to learn the language. And even today, right?
In my interpretation, it's hard to say which one turned on the other or vice versa. I think it's a holistic process in learning when you really have the interest or when you really have the willingness to
Yes, you have to have a reason for learning the language. Yes. Whether it's reading a text or traveling, you have to be able to feel like there's going to be a real purpose for you, rather than just whether that's practical or intellectual. When I had to study French as a high school student, I had no motivation.
Oh, really?
Later, no, because it was just about memorization and maybe some bits of culture. But later, when I wanted to read French poetry, I was more motivated.
When you can appreciate literature as storytelling, but I think that would be quite different from, let's say, you have to teach it to your students, right? Would they also appreciate literature as storytelling narratives? I don't think so. So I think there might be not necessarily the conflict, but there's definitely the debate in literature. Let's say from a student's perspective versus a teacher's perspective. We can also maybe interpret that kind of debate as whether we consider something like texts more for information or, let's say, message, or more for the purpose of the skills and techniques in writing.
Yes, it's very different if you're teaching a literature course for the purpose of improving ELA skills.
Okay, so now that is like a pretty clear definition to me, that you would define ELA as skills and techniques.
It's crucial for students to have.
Well,
those,
yes.
Those
as the name would indicate, right? So English language arts.
Right, but for instance, the way that composition used to be taught at the university level was through literature. You'd have 2 semesters. Maybe you'd write some basic essays, comparison contrast essays, or definition essays. But those wouldn't just be exercises in themselves. No, they were connected to reading, poetry, and drama. Now that's no longer the case. Students might take a composition course without ever having to read anything fictional. You can take a composition course and you may just have to write about, opinion articles or websites. You're learning those kinds of basic skills.
Your Like, which side would you be for in that kind of debate? Would you be more for the debate on the side of rhetorics or?
Well, I think the needs in the contemporary academy more or less trend away from studying text seriously in a writing course. That doesn't mean that you can't think seriously about the kinds of the other kinds of quote-unquote texts, electronic texts, or media texts, and that's something that I do see reflected, even in IB courses. But I'd say it's very different. I think it differs quite a bit depending on what kind of institution you're at. At a place like Harvard or Cornell, you're not going to take a composition course that's generic, that's devoted to writing different kinds of essays.
I don't think you can find composition courses in those institutes at all.
Yes.
I don't think they have those choices.
Well, they have, for instance, what I taught at Penn. They have, quote-unquote freshman seminars. If you want to write about science, you take a course that...
Yeah, but that's not for major students, right? That's not for English students.
It's for everyone at the beginning.
Really?
Yes. There might be requirements if you want to, major in. But the idea is students are going to write about something that they're interested in. If you want to take, for instance, I taught film courses. I taught a course in Holocaust literature, but there were other courses in other departments writing across the curriculum. So in order to fulfill your writing requirement, it wasn't that you had to go to a composition course and then take an English or a history course after that. It was you began with studying with somebody who was in that field. But the principles of writing were supposed to be communicated, across the curriculum, no matter what subject matter you were dealing with in that course. That's very different, let's say, from the kind of introductory writing course that I would teach at University of Manitoba or a large state school, where students don't choose according to their interests. It's seen as a kind of generic set of skills that students have to learn. And so the challenge, if you're teaching in that context, is thinking about, how do you create a curriculum? How do you create a syllabus that's going to involve students, probably none of whom are humanities majors, since that's trending down.
Yeah, so that sounds more like point-to-point, just very technical and skillful.
Well, I've found that you can teach, even if you have a group of students who have no interest in reading literature, which
you don't have to have any interest.
Right.
Yeah, because you only take that as the technical, the skill-focused aspect of writing, then they write it with a purpose, right?
Yes.
And so they basically just involve all this kind of techniques to make the writing better overall.
But I think there's no way to really learn to write well if you're not also reading examples of...
So I think that might be the difference between, let's say, teaching university students versus teaching high school students. I feel that the kind of high school students who would get involved with our education system, or in a just say any private education system,
Yes.
Or even the majority of the public system, they would still focus quite heavily on the text.
Yes, I mean, there's even in the time that I've been teaching at Sister Sophie, there's certainly a range of students. Some students really do simply need to understand how to write their school assignments well. Other students are really looking for a kind of enrichment that goes beyond that. And I think it's important to distinguish, the students' goals, the students' needs.
Yeah, I would say that either way, I think there might be lots of criticism towards, let's say, contemporary education system. I think before the postgraduate level, let's say high school, middle school, high school, I think the focus on the text, the context is still the priority of learning literature or teaching literature from the teacher's perspective. I really like that as perspective But criticism comes from, I have to say, comparison and contrast. So I feel that's a different discussion.
Can you say a little more what you mean about criticism and comparison and contrast?
Yeah, well, I think I had this discussion with a previous speaker at the international lecture series at Queen's. So basically, when I say criticism, that's more towards contemporary education system in terms of the changes we can observe, like when you mention things like, oh, there's lack of attention, increasingly shorter attention span, and no willingness or no eager to read long texts, that kind of thing.
Yes.
So that's where comparison and contrast comes within the context of educational system. So we're looking at how, let's say, contemporary education system is different, let's say, from 100 years ago, where school is not necessarily as prevalent as it is right now. So in that kind of discussion, I feel that criticism is unavoidable.
So by criticism, do you mean understanding things critically, or do you mean...
No. I just generally mean that in a way it's deteriorating.
Yes, so you mean something more like, more like ideology. Thinking about criticism.
I guess. But if we're thinking about the question between, let's say, high school or secondary level of education versus, let's say, post-secondary level of education, then I would still always prefer the priority shared within general secondary education context.
Yeah, I mean, comparison and contrast, it's really in some ways the most basic skill of writing and analysis.
Yes.
And it's something that I think is very important to to establish at the secondary school level. It's so important being able to just understand similarities and differences and what to do with those. So whether you're talking about comparing cultures or comparing texts. Sometimes I teach Plato's allegory of the cave, and what you see in that they call it an allegory. It's really a very complex image, kind of living image, and it depends on comparison and contrast, being aware of something else that you need to compare what whether it's an opinion or a perception. But if you don't have that other thing to compare it with, you have a one-dimensional view of what you're looking at. And I think this is often the difficulty of the way that students learn writing at the secondary school level. For instance, they have to write a persuasive essay, and they may have to take a position on an issue and just write paragraphs that support their position on that issue without really considering the counter-argument or the question. And I think going from high school to university writing, that's the biggest challenge, being able to write a thesis that's not simply a one-sided thesis.
With those ideas, when young scholars make their academic choice, do you think humanities studies are still preferred in general? And what conditions or requirements do come with such a choice? What level of efforts, mindset, personality does it take to keep the passion and the work as a lifelong pursuit?
So you mean scholars that have academic aspirations?
Yes, of course.
I mean, I'd say now, first of all, the job market has changed so much, so much in the last 10 or 15 years that even somebody who wants to make an academic carear as a teacher of literature understands that
they would maybe take a second thought.
It's extremely difficult if you love medieval literature and you want to spend 4 years or 6 years specializing in medieval literature.
Too bad, you cannot find a job.
Right. So what I see in younger scholars in the humanities is that the way that they define themselves has become more interdisciplinary and more ideologically pitched. In other words, if I want to study literature and be able to sell myself on the market as a scholar of literature, it doesn't really matter, in a sense, whether I'm talking about quote-unquote post-colonial novels or Shakespeare. I have to have a kind of
there's a very strong sense of, for me, the sense is very it's full of contradiction, but for others it might just ambivalent when you say, when scholars have to sell themselves to the market.
Talk to graduate students who are finishing and going to conferences like MLA and looking for jobs. It really comes down to, in some ways, looking at students as future customers. What's going to, apart from the kinds of required courses that humanities scholars may have to teach, which are increasingly taught by part-time people. If you want to get a job that's not precarious, right, and you really want to pursue literary study, then you can't do it in the classic way. You have to do it according to the changed market.
I totally understand, but I'm in a slightly different perspective to comment on that. I think it's really probably because I couldn't appreciate the kind of discomfort you mentioned about being confronted by the job market or whatsoever. I think that sounds like a very ridiculous thing to even think about.
Well, I think there are people who still just love what they're doing, don't care about that.
Yeah.
And those are, I think, usually the people who, if they can find a place for themselves, end up being the best teachers. But when it comes to what you need to do in the academy, it's really all about placement and publication, etc. The way that you're judged as a teacher is, I won't say of minor importance, but it's probably secondary to how many citations you have and the number of students that you've taught. I think, well, it certainly doesn't have the same cultural capital that it did, but it's also, back in the 19th century, most people were not connected to the kind of education that we think about when we think about the humanities. Now, in the last 100 or 120 years, where the economy's changed and mass education is important. It wasn't necessarily important for people who were in an agricultural economy to know how to write essays. And so I think there's always going to be people who are connected to the past in a living way. It might change in terms of the way that that's placed in institutions. So we're no longer teaching Greek and Latin in high school to the same degree, even though there are still many students who learn those languages and who are drawn toward them. So sort of using that as an example of something that would go back to the Renaissance notion of recovering the classical world and defining the humanities. I think it's paradoxical that in some ways it's difficult from the perspective of studying classics, studying Homer and Shakespeare, to see the vitality or the creativity that might be in other areas of the culture. And so connecting those things, at least on the level of high school or first-year university students, if you can talk about the way that what's going on in a Shakespeare play is really similar to, but maybe much richer than the Netflix series that they're watching, I think that there may not be as much of a bottleneck as there might seem to be, from that that older perspective.
No, it's not older. Total optimistic perspective. I like that. Really optimistic.
Well, I think it comes from students are still hungry for the kinds of things that the humanities teach. They may need to be packaged differently. They may need to be able to be put into different contexts, right? So if I teach Shakespeare as if it was something that was old and dry and needs to be done in period dress, rather than something that comes from a living question, then it might
Yeah, I
seem-
guess I can see what you're saying in a practical way to some degree, in the sense that, like among just public high schools, or even in private high schools in general, teachers would always ask the students to watch different versions of Shakespeare plays when it comes to the reading of the book, and so hopefully they can gain comparative understandings or comparative interpretations from different versions.
Yeah.
I think that's a very practical example of what you just said about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not overly optimistic about institutions.
Institutions, you mean like universities mainly, or?
Yes, and it's coming from my experience as a graduate student, where, when I took a course in Milton as a graduate student, I wasn't reading Milton. I was reading, ideological, I was reading Marx, not Milton, because that was the way that the professor looked at the literature. And I think that's, it might sound strange, but I think that's something that's really, in many ways, shaped the current generation of scholars. It's not that there aren't people around.
I've heard similar comments from other people as well. They're all saying that they're not optimistic about institutions, but I don't know what that means, and I don't know how that would lead higher education towards what kind of future. I have no answers to those kind of questions, but you're not the only one.
Yeah, I don't have answers to them either, but I think maybe it comes from getting older. But what matters to me now is the kind of interactions that go on between people, whether it's in a classroom or outside of a classroom. And I think, the wonderful thing about universities is not necessarily the curriculum or the institutional structure, but the fact that people are together and they're in a place where they may have a conversation that wouldn't happen elsewhere. And when students are just, in that, coming from, I went to university when I was 17. In that period of years between the time when you come of age, when you're an adolescent, and the time that you actually go to work, there's real possibilities for students to wake up, for students to see different things. And so I think I'm optimistic about that possibility, even though I'm not sure that is really the purpose of many classrooms today.